In 1945, Korea was one country, one language, one culture, one GDP per capita. Both halves received the same inheritance from the same Japanese colonial government. Then the country was divided along a line drawn in 2 hours by 2 American officers using a National Geographic map. North got the industry, South got the farms. Every serious analyst in 1945 predicted the North would be richer. Today, South Korea's GDP per capita is approximately $35,000. North Korea's is approximately $600. South Korea is the 13th largest economy on Earth, home to Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and POSCO. North Korea cannot keep its lights on after 10 p.m. The satellite image of the Korean peninsula at night, South Korea blazing, North Korea dark, is one of the most reproduced economic photographs in history. They started equal. One of them is now a global economic power. One of them cannot feed its own people. This episode is the story of how that happened, and the answer is not geography, not natural resources, not foreign aid. The answer is the choices 2 governments made about how an economy should be organized. The Korean Peninsula is one of the most intensively studied natural experiments in economic history. 2 populations, genetically identical, 1 language, 1 culture, 1 starting point, divided by a line that was never meant to be permanent, a temporary military boundary agreed in 1945 that became, after the Korean War, the most heavily fortified border on Earth. This episode tells the economic biography of that divergence, from the Japanese colonial inheritance through the Korean War, through the decisions each government made in the 1960s that set the 2 economies on opposite trajectories, through the famine that killed between 600,000 and 900,000 North Koreans in the 1990s, through the nuclear program that chose weapons over food, and to the present day, where South Korea produces cutting-edge semiconductors for the world and North Korea produces ballistic missiles for Russia. Welcome to Macro Atlas. This is the most extreme economic divergence in the history of 2 countries that were ever the same country. Chapter 1. Before the Division. Japan colonized Korea in 1910 and held it for 35 years. During that period, Japan made a deliberate and economically rational choice. Concentrate heavy industry in the north, where the coal, iron ore, and hydroelectric power were located, and use the south as an agricultural supplier. By 1945, when Japan surrendered, the northern half of Korea had the majority of the peninsula's industrial capacity: steel mills, chemical plants, munitions factories, and one of the most extensive hydroelectric systems in Asia. The southern half had most of the farmland and most of the population. This is why serious analysts in 1945 expected the North to be the wealthier Korea. The physical capital was there, the industrial base was there, the power generation was there. What happened instead is the story this episode tells. Before I tell you what happened, I want you to think about this. If you were designing an economy in 1945 and you could choose between inheriting the industrial north or the agricultural south of Korea, which would you choose? Most people would choose the north. The answer to this episode is partly about why that choice turned out to be wrong, and why it turned out to be wrong for reasons that had nothing to do with the factories. Chapter 2. The Division. On August 10, 1945, 2 American Army colonels, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, were given 30 minutes to draw a boundary dividing Korea into Soviet and American occupation zones. They used a National Geographic magazine map. Neither spoke Korean, neither had been to Korea. They drew the line along the 38th parallel because it was a convenient latitude that left the capital, Seoul, in the American zone. The entire process took approximately 2 hours. The line was supposed to be temporary, a military convenience pending a peace settlement. Instead, it became permanent, the boundary between 2 states with 2 incompatible political systems,
hardened by the Korean War into one of the most fortified borders in human history. The Korean War of 1950 to 1953 transformed the temporary line into a permanent one. 3 years of fighting killed an estimated 2.5 million soldiers and civilians. It ended in an armistice, not a peace treaty, meaning technically North and South Korea are still at war today. The 38th parallel became the demilitarized zone, 248 kilometers of fortified border, guarded by more than 1 million troops, the most militarized stretch of land on Earth. In 1953, both countries were devastated. Seoul had been captured and recaptured 4 times. Pyongyang had been bombed to rubble by U.S. air forces. General Curtis LeMay estimated that American bombing destroyed 75 to 80% of North Korea's cities. Both countries were starting from near zero. GDP per capita in both was roughly equivalent, approximately $100 in current dollars, similar to the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa at the time.
Chapter 3. South Korea's Miracle. South Korea's economic miracle, called the Miracle on the Han River, is one of the most studied cases in development economics. In 1962, South Korea's GDP per capita was approximately $100. By 1989, it was $5,400. By 2006, it crossed $20,000. Today, it is $35,000. In less than 60 years, South Korea went from one of the poorest countries in Asia to the 13th largest economy on Earth. The architect of this transformation was Park Chung-hee, a military general who took power in a coup in 1961 and ruled until his assassination in 1979. Park was not a Democrat. His government suppressed labor unions, imprisoned political opponents, and used the state apparatus with authoritarian efficiency to direct the economy. He is a deeply contested figure in South Korea, simultaneously credited with building the modern economy and condemned for the political repression that accompanied it. Park's economic strategy had 4 pillars. First, export-led growth. South Korea would not develop by protecting its domestic market, but by competing in world markets, forcing Korean companies to reach international standards or die. Second, the chaebol system. Park chose a small number of family-owned conglomerates, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, Daewoo, and directed state credit, cheap loans, and market protection to them, creating Korean versions of the Japanese industrial groups that had occupied Korea. Third, massive investment in education. South Korea's literacy rate rose from 22% in 1945 to near universal by 1970. Fourth, openness to foreign technology and capital, with the explicit goal of absorbing and eventually surpassing foreign industrial knowledge. The results were extraordinary. South Korea's export volume rose from $480 million in 1962 to a projected $127 billion in 1990. Manufacturing grew from 14% of GDP to 30% in the same period. In 1986, Hyundai exported its first cars to the United States. In 1992, Samsung produced its first semiconductor chip. In 2025, South Korea's semiconductor exports reached a record $15 billion in a single month. The country that Park Chung-hee inherited, which had no natural resources, minimal industry, and was dependent on U.S. aid, became the country that makes the chips inside your phone. The most important single decision in South Korea's development was the one Park made in 1965: open the economy. Sign a trade agreement with Japan, Korea's former colonizer, a decision that required enormous political courage, and use the reparations payment of $300 million to build POSCO, the steel company that became the backbone of Korean industrialization.
Every subsequent Korean industrial success, Hyundai cars, Samsung chips, LG appliances, was built on POSCO steel.
Chapter 4. North Korea's Collapse. North Korea in 1953 chose a different path. Kim Il-sung, installed by the Soviet Union as North Korea's leader, built a system called juche, self-reliance. The explicit ideological rejection of the export-led, foreign capital-dependent development model that Park Chung-hee would later choose in the South. North Korea would develop by relying on itself, guided by the Korean Workers' Party, organized around the personality of the great leader. In the 1950s and 1960s, the North Korean economy actually grew faster than the South. The Soviet Union and China provided substantial economic assistance, industrial equipment, technical expertise, cheap energy. The inherited Japanese industrial base was rebuilt. In 1965, North Korea's GDP per capita was still roughly equal to South Korea's. The divergence had not yet happened. It began in the early 1970s. North Korea's centrally planned economy, efficient at directing resources toward a specific target, heavy industry, military production, proved structurally incapable of the kind of adaptive, market-responsive diversification that Park Chung-hee's South Korea was achieving. When the Soviet Union began demanding market prices for its energy exports to North Korea in the 1970s, Pyongyang couldn't pay. Energy shortages hit the industrial base. Agricultural productivity fell as fertilizer production declined. The food rationing system, which had been generous in the 1960s, began to tighten. Chapter 5. The Arduous March. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was catastrophic for North Korea in a way that is impossible to overstate. The USSR had been supplying North Korea with approximately 1 million tons of oil per year at heavily subsidized prices. Russian grain, machinery, and technical assistance underpinned the North Korean industrial and agricultural system. When the Soviet Union dissolved and Russia demanded payment in hard currency at market prices, the North Korean economy did not slow, it fell off a cliff. Between 1990 and 1999, North Korea's GDP is estimated to have declined by approximately 50%. Electricity output collapsed. Without electricity, the irrigation pumps stopped. Without irrigation, harvests failed. Without harvests, the food rationing system, which had been the regime's primary mechanism of social control since the 1950s, broke down entirely. In 1995 and 1996, catastrophic flooding destroyed what remained of the harvest. What followed was the Arduous March, the North Korean government's euphemism for the famine of 1994 to 1998. Estimates of the death toll ranged from 240,000 to 900,000 people, with the most credible academic estimates suggesting approximately 600,000 deaths in a country of 22 million people. In the worst affected provinces, between 10 and 15% of the population died, not from war, from hunger. The famine had one unintended consequence that the regime could not control. It destroyed the food rationing system that had been the regime's primary mechanism of social control since the 1950s. When the state could no longer feed people, people began feeding themselves, through informal markets, through barter, through what North Koreans called jangmadong, marketplaces. The regime tried to suppress these markets. It failed. By the late 1990s, a parallel private economy existed in North Korea that the state could not eliminate. Defectors report that by 2010, a majority of North Koreans earned the majority of their income from private market activity, not from state wages. This matters for understanding the North Korean economy today. The formal GDP figures, $26.6 billion, according to the Bank of Korea's 2025 estimate, significantly undercount the private market economy. North Korea is not purely a command economy.
It is a command economy with a substantial informal market sector that the state alternately tolerates and suppresses depending on political needs.
Chapter 6. The Nuclear Calculation. Kim Jong-il, who inherited power from his father Kim Il-sung in 1994, made a strategic calculation that every subsequent event has confirmed from his perspective. The nuclear weapons program was not a luxury for North Korea. It was the regime's survival strategy. The lesson Kim Jong-il drew from the 1990s was not that the economic system needed reform. It was that North Korea needed a deterrent that made regime change too costly for any outside power to attempt. Libya gave up its nuclear program in 2003 under international pressure. Muammar Gaddafi was dead by 2011. Saddam Hussein had no nuclear weapons. He was dead by 2006. Kim Jong-il watched both of these events and drew the obvious conclusion. The nuclear program was not the problem, it was the solution. Under Kim Jong-un, who inherited power in 2011, North Korea tested its first hydrogen bomb in 2017 and declared itself a complete nuclear weapons state. The sanctions that followed, UN Security Council resolutions cutting 90% of North Korea's legal export revenue, have been the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever applied to any country. They have not produced denuclearization. They have produced the most isolated and impoverished large population on Earth. The economic paradox of North Korea today is documented in the Bank of Korea's August 2025 report. North Korea's economy grew 3.7% in 2024, the fastest growth since 2005. The growth was driven by military exports, specifically the sale of artillery shells and ballistic missiles to Russia for use in Ukraine, and by a resumption of Chinese trade. North Korea is growing. Its people are not becoming wealthier. Rice prices doubled in 2024 and doubled again in 2025. The North Korean won fell from 8,000 per dollar in mid-2024 to 36,000 per dollar by late 2025. GDP grows when weapons are exported. The people who make the weapons cannot afford to eat. Chapter 7. What is actually different? The standard explanation for the North-South divergence is political: democracy versus dictatorship, capitalism versus communism. This explanation is incomplete. Park Chung-hee, who built South Korea's miracle, was a military dictator. The single-party developmental state model that South Korea used in the 1960s and 1970s bears more resemblance to North Korea's political structure than it does to American liberal democracy. The difference was not freedom. The difference was economic. South Korea chose export-led growth, production tested by world markets, which ruthlessly eliminates inefficiency. North Korea chose import substitution and self-reliance, production directed by the state, which has no mechanism to eliminate inefficiency because there is no market price signal to tell you that something is being produced at too high a cost. South Korea chose to integrate into the global economy, foreign capital, foreign technology, foreign markets. North Korea chose juche, self-reliance as an ideology, which meant closing the economy to information flows, prices, competition, technology transfer that drive productivity growth. An economy that cannot import ideas cannot innovate. North Korea in 2025 makes better nuclear weapons than it made in 2006. It makes the same refrigerators. South Korea invested in human capital, universal education, then university expansion, then one of the world's highest rates of tertiary education. North Korea also invested in education, but the education system is designed around political loyalty,
not economic productivity. A country where the most talented young people are trained to revere the Kim family is not efficiently allocating its human capital.
Chapter 8. What the divergence actually proves. The Korean divergence is the cleanest natural experiment in economic history because the two populations are as close to identical as any two populations can be. Same ethnicity, same language, same culture, same colonial history, same GDP per capita in 1953. The only variable is the economic and institutional choices made by two governments. What the South Korean case proves is not that capitalism always works, or that authoritarianism is compatible with development, or that any particular model is universally applicable. What it proves is one specific thing: an economy that connects to world markets, prices its goods at market rates, and allows information about relative efficiency to direct resources. That economy can achieve extraordinary results even without natural resources, even without foreign aid dependency, even starting from near zero. What the North Korean case proves is equally specific: an economy that severs itself from world market prices, directs resources through political rather than economic logic, and substitutes ideological loyalty for efficiency as the measure of success. That economy cannot generate sustained productivity growth. It can grow when it has external support, as North Korea did with Soviet assistance in the 1950s and 1960s. It can generate GDP figures when it exports weapons, as it does today, but it cannot generate the compounding productivity improvements that turn a poor country into a rich one. Because compounding productivity requires feedback, prices, competition, the constant pressure of the market telling producers what is worth making and what is not. That feedback North Korea chose to eliminate. In 1945, two American officers drew a line on a National Geographic map in 2 hours. They could not have imagined that 80 years later, one side of that line would contain one of the world's most advanced economies, and the other side would contain one of the world's most severe economic failures. The line did not cause the divergence. The choices made on either side of it did. That is the economic biography of Korea. Thank you for watching Macro Atlas. The China episode, which tells the story of how one country chose to partially re-enter the world economy after decades of self-reliance, is on the channel. Subscribe for the next chapter.